Welcome back to Cheddar's opening bell. The nationwide protests that we've seen come from a frustration that has been largely ignored for decades, if not centuries. Now, as we've seen the overwhelming outcry for change, the question becomes how? Ben Jealous was the youngest ever president of the NAACP and the 2018 Democratic nominee to be Maryland's governor. He joins us now to discuss. Ben, really great to have you on this morning. You watched the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. How did we get from there to these demonstrations now? This wasn't a sudden escalation, right?
No, look, first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. And whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement, whether it's the protests that became known as the Boston Massacre, people in our country have for centuries been opposed to abusive behavior by those who are supposed to protect us. And what's frustrating is that this is not new. It's simply being caught on tape. And so it's become intolerable to a much broader range of people. And there is a need for us to finally move forward. The way we move forward, we've got to create national standards for how our officers behave. We have to create national standards for how they're trained. We have to make sure that it's possible to hold them accountable. When you look at the number of people who have been killed by officers and the number of officers who have been fired and the number of officers who have been convicted, those punishments are so small that they really speak to the fact that most officers, I think, rightly believe that they can kill people and get away with it.
Your hometown of Baltimore saw its own round of riots in 2015 after the Freddie Gray case. What did the city learn in the wake of that, and has it made a difference?
One of the things that we learned is that you have to act aggressively to get bad officers off the force. After those uprisings in our city, we saw waves and waves of prosecutions of bad officers. First it was at the city jail, where 4 officers got pregnant by the same inmate at the same time. And then that spurred an investigation that ultimately resulted in about 40 officers being prosecuted. Then it was our gun trace task force here in Maryland. Guns guns that are used by criminals are brought in typically from other states where it's easier to purchase them. And these were supposed to be the elite officers that were getting those guns off the street. And it turns out that they were simply a band of thugs who was mugging people, robbing people, shipping drugs out of state to bad officers to be dealt. And so we have a backlog of dealing with corruption on the force, dealing with bad officers. We've got to be very aggressive about dealing with them. I come from a law enforcement family. My grandfather was in law enforcement. My cousins just this morning picked up their badge and their guns and went to work. There are lots of good officers, but the bad officers make this a more dangerous country for all of us, including the good officers.
Of course, this is all happening in the backdrop of a presidential election. So I just want to talk a little bit of politics right now. We heard from President Trump yesterday. We, of course, saw that extremely controversial photo op. If the president called you for advice right now, what would you tell him? Is there anything that you would suggest that he could say or do that would help diffuse the situation?
Now, if I spoke to Mr. Trump, I would say, look, you are president of a democracy, which means that this is not simply about your positional power like it might be, in an autocracy. It is also about your moral authority. And because you have sided in such a partisan way, frankly, with the worst officers, you have lost that moral authority with most people in this country when it comes to this issue. And the way to get it back is not to, use a Bible for a photo op, but rather to allow yourself for a moment to empathize with the people who are terrified by the way that the police have been behaving or allowed to behave in so many communities, and to speak from the heart, as if, just think for a second, what if that was your child? What if George Floyd was your son, your cousin, your friend? This president has shown that he's capable of empathy, but he seems to wall off Black people too often from that empathy. For example, and one of the things I think he needs to do, sooner rather than later, is to admit that the Central Park Five are innocent. The fact that he continues to insist that they're guilty, even though DNA has proven their innocence, makes him seem quite frankly, racist to the core in a way that is deeply disturbing. So this president has to, I think, take a step back, actually go into his own past and say, I was wrong about the Central Park Five, and has to put himself in the shoes of people who don't look like him and say, what happened to George Floyd cannot be allowed to happen again, and I will, as president, ensure that we actually make progress on this issue. But he's not doing that, and the sad part is this: every Republican before him, frankly, has been better at holding on to the moral authority of the presidency. We are now at an all-time low. You can look back to Richard Nixon, as confusing as that may sound, for inspiration. He could on how to deal better with this. He's doing such a bad job that even Reagan and Nixon could be used to show him how to do better.
That is a great perspective. I wanted to get your take on this because there has been blurred lines between the peaceful protesters and the people who are out there rioting and looting. And I read an op-ed this morning in the New York Daily News from Errol Lewis. He says some of the blame for the chaos in the streets needs to be put at the doorsteps of the activists who called people to the streets without ensuring that the effort would further an agenda, put pressure on a specific target, or advance relevant, winnable demands. And he actually points to this example many years ago with Al Sharpton, who had organized a civil rights demonstration and told the crowd, "No violence. If anybody gets out of line and starts that stuff, I will turn you over to the police myself." Do you think there's anything to this? Do the protest organizers need to try to get control back? And is that even possible in a time like this?
One of the things that we did in Baltimore in the midst of the uprisings, it was on day 2, was Pastor Jamal Bryant and I put out word to the activists who'd been in the streets the night before and said that we would hold nonviolent civil disobedience trainings for hours before they went back into the protests again. And that needs to happen now. My parents' generation, my grandparents' generation were trained by the civil rights movement. Mine was trained by the Free South Africa movement. We have not trained most of this generation of activists, some of them, but not most of them. And we need to urgently be training them. You have to have discipline as an officer. You have to have discipline as a protester. The other thing that we found in Baltimore is that we had 2 groups of provocateurs who were really, frankly, destroying things. One was what you might refer to as like a bad activist, folks who came there as bad actors with incendiary devices trying to stir up trouble. Folks like that are criminals. They need to be dealt with as such. Sharpton is absolutely right. The second group turned out to be bad officers. We had 26 pharmacies rolled during our protests, robbed, all of the drugs that you could sell on the street stolen. It came out years later that the most likely culprits was a ring of bad officers. And so there are all sorts of people that you find out in the wake exploit these moments for criminal purposes. Those are criminals. They need to be dealt with as such.
Wow, that that is incredible. It's funny, just history. You get just such a different perspective on what actually happened. All right, if someone out there wants to show support for this movement, but they just can't physically join a protest, what can they do? What are some actionable ways that people can support this movement?
I'm so glad that you asked that question. Quite frankly, I'm very concerned that we will see a spike in COVID cases. We have people screaming at the top of their lungs in close proximity to each other in the midst of a pandemic with a highly contagious respiratory disease. There are a lot of great ways to help. One of the simplest is to support people who are running for office who you believe will bring real change. And we need folks to, frankly, support Joe Biden in this moment. We need folks to support any candidate who you think can move us beyond this moment in your local city council. We have elections in Baltimore today. If you have not voted and you're in Baltimore, please go vote. At the same time, folks need to be on the phones, on their computers, sending messages to their officials, telling them it's time for us to actually properly train our officers. One of the moments in these protests that sticks with me was the young lady who went to speak to an officer who was marching. They were really marching through the streets of New York, and he threw her to the ground. And when you see an officer behave like that, that's an officer who's certainly poorly disciplined and poorly behaved and should be, dealt with. but it's also typically an officer who is poorly trained. In England, the national standard is that officers are trained every 6 months in how and when to escalate force, and most importantly, how to de-escalate situations. In England, most officers don't carry guns, and here in the U.S., every officer carries a gun. And the most common training across our 16,000 police agencies, local, state, national, of all types, and it varies. But the most common standard is that you're only trained once in when to escalate force, and that's one day, like 9 to 5 at the academy. We have to do much better. Our officers, frankly, have a license to carry a gun and to kill people under certain circumstances. We give them way too much latitude and not enough training, and that's a formula for the type of disaster we quite frankly see way too much of.
All right. Really great to have you on. Ben Jealous, former NAACP president. Thank you for all of your insights.